Welcome to our EM service. We're glad you are here. We are glad you are all here in the room, and all of you guys watching on the screen. We're glad you're here today. Today, our message title is out of Genesis 22, Testing to Trust the Promise Keeper, in Genesis chapter 22. So, who here, when I say the word test, what comes to mind? Math test. Okay, what else? A spelling test, okay? This is their world right now, right? Spelling tests, math tests, what else? What other test? Jalen's like, I'm done with college. I'm done with tests, okay? There are always going to be tests, and most tests that we think of, usually what do you think? Are you like, I can't wait for my test tomorrow. I'm so excited. I don't think anyone has ever said that, okay? Tests often bring up for us something negative, some kind of anxiety. Who has really bad test anxiety? You can study all you want, and the minute you see the test, like your mind goes blank, you know? Or you get really anxious. Tests often for us are negative. But tests, if they're built well, what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to prove that you know what you're doing or that what you're made of, like a driver's test, okay? Do you guys do parallel parking in driver's? You guys are a bunch of wimps here in Colorado. So in Arizona, the first thing you have to do when you're 16 is to parallel park. That's the very first thing they make you do. Because if you can't pass that, you can't even do the rest of the test. You fail automatically. And so the trick is to go to the DMV at night when like no one's there, the hours are done, and they have these like cones like already set out like permanently on there. And the minute you touch any one of those cones, you fail. Or if you don't get close enough, there's like a line right here, whatever your parallel parking sign is. And if your tires don't touch that line enough, like close enough, then you fail. And so I remember being 16, or I was like, 16. And there's one by our house, and we would go like every night. And it was such like a stressful experience in my life because it's hard to, who knows how to parallel park? No? You guys don't know how to parallel park? You like, know how to, you like go this way? Okay, good. Nowadays, like there's like the back cameras and stuff. Man, in 2000, whatever year that was, 5 or whatever it was, 2004, there were no backwards cameras. Or like, you know those like beep, 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 beep when you get close? Didn't have that. We had to learn the old-fashioned way. But every time I go park somewhere, I'm thankful for that test because that's probably the only reason why I could parallel park. Any test in life, it's going to bring up some measure of anxiety. But tests are part of life. And in our spiritual journey, there will be tests as well. And so, today, we're talking about tests. Last week, the promised son was finally born. Isaac is finally born. And the promise that Abraham was waiting for 25 years finally happens. And here in Genesis 22, now Isaac's probably in his 20s. It's been like 20-some years. And he's a grown man, okay? Who here is almost 20? Daniel, okay? So Isaac is like around Daniel to Sam's age, somewhere in that window, okay? 20s to 30s. So basically everybody in this room almost is encompassed in that age range, okay? So Isaac is a young man now. And everything is going well. And here we have, in Genesis 22, verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. Abram, God called him. Yes, he replied, here I am. 25 years is a long time to be tested in your faith. I would think at this point, God is like, Abraham, you get like a pass, like a homework pass, because like you've suffered for a long time. But here he is, God is saying, I'm going to give you one last major test. Now, when we experience tests or trials or hardships in our lives, we often think God is gone, right? Like when you experience something hard or difficult, or something like really awful or painful or difficult, most of us think that God is absent, or we think, how could God be real if he can allow this thing to happen in my life? It's a legitimate question. And if you have never asked that before, you haven't lived long enough. At some point in your life, you will ask that question. But the point is, we think if a test comes or a trial comes, something difficult comes, we think God is gone. We think God is absent. And yet, here's the important thing here. oftentimes in the testing, it's God who's in the middle of it. Now, let me give you an important distinction. There is a difference between tests and evil, right? We learned evil is what? Evil is a corruption of good. God never created evil. He created good. And out of that came the corruption of good as evil. So there are evil things that do happen to people in our lives. Evil things that nobody ever chooses. Nobody has no choice over. Most of the time, if you hear people who were like abused as children, that is evil. They had no choice over that. That is not a test from God, okay? Do you hear that? Like, I want you to hear that. When you think of, oh, God allows tests, that means that awful thing that happened to me that I had no choice and control over, that was God. No. There's a difference between tests and evil, okay? And God allows tests. God does not condone evil. But because we live in a broken world or the fallenness of sin, there is evil in this world. So I want to really clearly make that clear. The things that happen to us that are evil, that is not something God wants or allows. But there are other things that do happen in our lives. And sometimes we have control over it, sometimes we don't. But those things can often be tests. And tests actually, when we think God is absent in a test, actually, it might be proof that God is actually with you. Let me spin that. Like, you're like, what? When I think of a test, I think of like God being gone or God's left or God's abandoned me or where is God, we often ask. But most of the time, actually, when you face something difficult in your life, that might actually be proof that God is with you, that God is moving in your life. Open your phones right now, since, those three over there already are taking notes already. Okay, open your phones. And open up your notes, because I'm pretty sure, does anyone else take notes on their phone? Thank you, Jalen. I feel like so seen, okay? I bet you Caitlin's like, I have never touched this app in my life, okay? So open up your notes or some kind of place you like write on your phone. And literally the three things you have on there are probably from me telling you each Sunday to write something. So open up today and put November 12th, 2023. Okay, and now I want you to write down. So think of a test happening in your life right now. What is the test happening in your life right now? And just jot it down. It doesn't have to be long or lengthy. But you can say, Stacy's making me do this. And she's making me answer the question, what's a test happening in my life right now? Okay, maybe it's like a hard friend thing. Maybe you're having a friend relationship issue. Maybe you don't know what's coming in the future and it scares you. Maybe I don't know, the whole world's going to end tomorrow and you're freaking out. Like, whatever it is, what test are you going through? What keeps you up at night? What are you drowning away in your sorrows? Okay? Like, what are the things that stress you out? What are the things that you're like, I think I might need some help with this? Okay. You guys got lots of tests in your life. Y'all are still writing for a long time. Okay? Write this down. Whatever test it is. Okay? I'll give you like 10 more seconds and you're going to put your phones down. I promise we're going to come back to it. Okay? Okay. So put your phones back down. Now, whatever you wrote on there, okay, whatever things you put on there, I want to challenge you. You might think that God is absent, and that's why those tests are happening. You might think because God has abandoned me, that's why these hard things are happening to me. But I want to challenge you. That test you just wrote down, it might actually be proof that God is moving in your life already. That God is working in your life already. Because one of the only ways for God to grow your faith is through testing. As hard as that is, that's the only way. How many of you when you were kids, you guys woke up in the middle of the night and your legs were hurting like super bad? Not me because I'm short. So like Nick, only Nick experienced that because he's tall now, okay? I did have growing pains. Just not a lot of growth came from the growing pains, okay? But I remember like waking up, how you're like, oh my, like, it hurts so bad. And like Korean moms are like massaging your legs and they're like, it means you're going to grow. It's great. And you're like, it hurts. And then you end up being 5'2" from when you're 12 until now. And so, but the point being, you can't grow without some measure of pain. You can't grow in your faith. You can't grow in your relationship. You can't grow in your convictions without some testing. And so I want to challenge you to understand that God allows testing in your life to grow your faith, to reveal your faith, to strengthen you. And so therefore, when we have that mindset of like, oh, this hard thing is happening to me, instead of us being offended at God, it's a chance for us to be like, oh, God is actually moving in my life. I don't have to be offended because that means God is with me. He's doing something. Here we are. In verse 1, the only response Abraham was, it's me. I'm here. What's up? Let's do this. Here we go in verse 2. Genesis 22, verse 2. It says, take your son, your only son. Okay, so far it's not bad. It's like, oh, I do love this son. You gave him to me. Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. He's like, okay. And then it goes downhill from here. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. Go and sacrifice. This is not just about killing his son, okay? No one should read this and be like, God wants us to kill children. That is very sharply out of context. However, it seems like that, right? It seems like that. But it's not just killing the son, it's going against God's promise. It's going against God's word. Last week, the promised son, God does exactly as he promised. And yet here we see he's doing the exact opposite. With any test, there is a purpose for that test. With any test. And so, what was the purpose of this test for Abraham? You know that thing you wrote on your phone? That test you're going through right now? You have to ask yourself the same question. What is God trying to teach me? What is God trying to show me? Now, when you were kids, how many of you are like the typical firstborn? My child and I are typical firstborns. I can tell he gets very stressed out when he doesn't do well. And so for me, I was just taking the test to get the good grade. I didn't remember anything from my test. You know what I mean? You get the grade and you're like, phew, and literally it's gone out of your brain. That means you didn't learn anything. A real test is a real test because you actually learn something. You actually grow from it. It's actually teaching you something. Open your phone, again, to that note, and read what you wrote down. What do you think God is teaching you from that? From this right now you're going through. Okay? Write down, what is God teaching me? ? And start jotting down. What do you think he's trying to teach you? What do you think he's trying to say? You know when you were a kid, and if you don't pass your test, what do you have to do? You have to retake the test, right? Or you have to correct your mistakes. If you don't do that, then what do you do? Just kidding, there's a lot more. But the point being, if you don't learn the test, you have to take the test again. And so it would behoove you and all of us if we would learn the test first. What is God trying to show me? And if I can try to grasp that now, maybe I can avoid a lot of heartache later. Because I don't want to be 50 years old and doing the same exact test as when I was 20. There are a lot of people who live like that, okay? And it's a very sad way to live. So, what is it that God's trying to teach you right now through this? Just jot down 2 thoughts, okay? And put your phone back down. Now, what was God trying to teach Abraham in that moment? Abraham had to learn the difference between trusting the blessing, trusting the good, trusting the promise, and trusting the promise giver, the one who would give the blessing. You know when you're a kid, who loves Santa Claus? Okay, Jisung loves Santa Claus. That's basically it. But the reality is, who actually loves the presents more than Santa Claus? As kids, we love the presents more than Santa Claus, right? Like, it's the same thing. I think God is often testing us. Do you love the blessing? Do you love the good things I can give you, or do you love me? We chase after the promise so much, we put the promise above the promise giver himself. That's the lesson most of us are learning. Will I chase after the promise, or will I chase after the one who gives the promise? Now, you might not remember, maybe you do, a couple of you, smart ones in the room. 3.5 years ago, on March 29th, 2020, I was looking back through my messages and I realized I was in Genesis in March 2020, actually, also. And March 29, 2020 was like 2 weeks or like a week and a half after everything shut down. And this was my message on that day, on March 29, 2020. And I gave this message about Genesis 22. I was like, oh, I didn't realize that. And so I gave that message on March 29, 2020. And I didn't tell you guys then, but I was pregnant at that time. And so I was really early in my pregnancy, and I gave that message. I did it online because we weren't meeting. And so I was in a dark room with one camera and doing that. And then the next day I went to my appointment that I was scheduled for. And they did my ultrasound, and they were like, something's a little weird. And I was like, it's not something you want to hear when you're And they're like, can you move for me? And I was like, okay. So the jelly stuff they put on you? And I was moving. And you could see a swishing in the picture. And they're like, are you in any pain? I was like, well, I mean, kind of. And they're like, I think you need to go to the hospital. I was like, why? They're like, I think you're bleeding internally. That's what the swishing is. It's blood. I was like, what? So I go to the hospital. It turns out my tube had ruptured where the pregnancy was. Baby was lost, and I was bleeding inside, literally. And so I called my husband, and I was like, I think you need to come. And he was like, what is going on? So I go into emergency surgery, and they said it'll take 2 hours. I think it took 4 or 5 hours. And I get out, and I had a really hard time waking up from anesthesia. And my surgeon came in to report, and they were like, you are very, very close. Very, very close. I was like, close to what? I was like, what are you talking about? And they're like, there was so much blood we had to pull out of you. That's why it took so long. They're like, you were very, very close. If you had come in a day later, you could have lost your life. I was like, what? I couldn't understand what was going on. And I remember coming home from that and feeling like when you realize you've been very close to death, a lot of stuff changes in your life for about a month. And then you kind of forget, and then you go back to the way it was. But the point being, I went back home and I was like, what is happening? And I looked at my messages, from 2020, and I realized I didn't preach for another month because I was literally healing from that surgery. And I remember thinking, wow, I had literally preached about that concept, and then I went into this huge season. And from that moment, I didn't realize it then, but I was in a really low place at that point, after that surgery. And because we've been trying to have more kids, And I was like, I didn't realize it, but I was in a very low point. And I realized I was chasing after the blessing more than the blessing giver. And that was really hard to realize because I was like, I literally preached about this. And now literally testing is happening. And literally I want to give up. I want to give up on God. I want to give up on everything. I can't explain all the details because there's more, but that was probably the lowest point in my faith was actually that year. And I realized that as hard as that time was, I was chasing after the thing that I wanted from God more than God himself. And so it wasn't until a year and a half later when I was finally okay, I'm done. I'm giving up on this dream. I don't want any more kids. I'm going to just trust that God has something good for us as a family of 3. And then I got pregnant with Young. But the point being, I realized this really sucks. That often through these difficult things, God is testing our faith. That was, I think, the lowest point in my faith so far, ever. And it was because I was wrestling with, how can God be the one who gives life? How can God be the one who some homeless lady on drugs on the street can get pregnant and have a healthy baby, and I cannot do this? Like, what is the point of this? And it was, I don't think I shared with you, it was very hard for me to preach during that time because I felt like a hypocrite. I felt like I was struggling to believe, and I had to share with you guys to believe. But through that season, it showed me faith is not earned cheaply. Faith in God, growing in God, knowing God, it's not earned cheaply. If I want to follow him, there will be a cost. But if I choose not to follow him, there's also a greater cost. There's a cost either way. Nothing is free in this world. And so which cost am I willing to pay? Which cost am I willing to pay? The testing in your life, we can't compare your testing to anyone else's. Your testing may seem like this big to you and this big to somebody else. What I went through, the person next to me is like, that's nothing. Maybe that's true. The point is not whose testing is worse than who else is. The point is, what is God doing in my life? Do I believe that he's with me in this testing? Do I believe that he's with me sitting in the dump of the ashes of my life right now? Do I believe that there is something still on the other end of this testing? Do I believe that he is still good? If you say he's good, believe me, he will test that in you. To the point where sometimes you're like, I don't know, man. I don't know if he's good. If you've already been there, I'm here to tell you that's okay. It's okay to have those doubts. Because doubt is actually proof that your faith is growing. Doubt often leads us to grow more in our faith. Now, look at the tests that God is giving you right now. What is God teaching you right now? Genesis 22, verse 3. Abram got up early the next morning. He chopped wood for the burnt offering and set out for where God told him to go. Now, he probably got up early because he probably didn't get any sleep, okay? Like, he probably didn't get much sleep, to be honest. But the funny thing is, in this verse, we don't see anything of what he felt or what he thought. There's no descriptive words. There's only verbs. Verbs are action words. We only see what Abraham did. That does not minimize what he thought or what he felt, but what counted was what he did. Now, Abraham resolved in his heart, even though I don't understand, even though I don't know what God is asking for me, I will do what he asks of me. Even though he didn't understand, even though he probably did not feel like obeying, he chose to still say yes. You know that like cheesy quote, when you walk 1,000 miles, the hardest step is the first one, okay? It's true. For Abraham, how was he able to live this kind of radical faith? We forget. In this moment of like, whoa, this is like Abraham's big moment. Who's run a marathon before? Nobody in this room. That's why we're all friends, okay? I have a friend of mine, though. She is 40 years old, and this friend of mine has 2 kids, and she's run like 3 marathons. She's insane. And marathons cannot be run overnight. You cannot do that. No matter how much you ran in high school or whatever, you cannot get up and do it overnight. There's so much training involved with this one marathon. In the same way with Abraham, this is his shining moment that we're like, wow, that's like such a picture of faith. We forget 25 years of waiting, 25 years of testing and failing utterly multiple times. He literally gave his wife away to Pharaoh. Okay, like you can't get much worse than that when the promise is for the 2 of you to have a child, okay? Like he royally screwed up multiple times. He failed, he doubted, he made some big mistakes that had big repercussions. And yet, 25 years of faith here and there, growing all the time, that's why he was able to do what he did. How many of you have been following God for 25 years faithfully? Okay? If you're like, oh, I just want to, Jesus, you're only 6. If you're like, I just like want to give up, I'm like, that's great. Call me in 25 years. And then if you still want to give up, then we can talk, okay? Like literally, that's what faith is not measured overnight. It's not measured in days. It's measured in decades. It's measured in decades. Look at your test right now that you're facing. Maybe this is the big one, but more likely than not, this is not the big one for you. This is your 25 years. This is your something that God's giving you right now to grow your faith slowly but surely. God is saying, this is a test, and I want you to pass it. Because without passing it, you cannot live out the fullness of the destiny I have for your life. Verse 4, on the 3rd day of their journey, Abraham sees the mountain, and he's like, the boy is like 20, but he's still a boy. The boy and I will travel a little further. We will worship there, and then we will come right back. Notice, we will go, we will come back. But he's going to sacrifice Isaac, like God told him to. So why does he use we? That we will come back. In Hebrews, it talks about how Abraham believed in his mind. He's like, God is good. He keeps his promise. The promised son is Isaac, period. I know that for a fact. And so if he's asking me to kill him, then that means he's going to raise him back to life. That's what he's going to do. Because there's no way that God can go back on his word. There is no way that God can break his promise. And so he's going to bring him back the frick to life, okay? Because that's the only option. That's the only way. All of the tests that you and I experience, all of that is to grow your faith. Now, think of a friend. You know that friend I'm talking about, okay? Or think about your husband or wife in the room, the two of you are husband and wife, or your boyfriend or girlfriend. Think about a big fight you've ever had. Think about the biggest fight you've had with your parents, the biggest fight you had with maybe not parents, that's bad. The biggest fight you had with a friend that you're still friends with, the biggest fight you ever had with your boyfriend or girlfriend, okay? I was like, oh, there's so much, okay? Okay, she's thinking really hard over there. That biggest fight, okay? Think about what happened after that fight. Most people in a good relationship, you will have that fight. But because of that fight, you are much stronger and you are much closer together because of that struggle. All relationships go through that struggle. Same thing with God. That testing that you wrote on your phone might be God growing your friendship with him. And so, how does the story end? You can read the rest of it, Genesis 22. He literally goes, builds the altar, ties him up, is literally ready to kill him, and the angel of God steps down and says, don't kill him. Verse 12, the last verse. Do not hurt him in any way, for now I know that you truly fear God, because you have obeyed me and have not withheld even your son, your only son. I swear by my name that I will certainly bless you. God never intended for Isaac to be sacrificed. All throughout Scripture, we see many times that God said, do not do what the nations around you do. What do? Those nations around them, a lot of what they did was child sacrifice. And God said, that is the thing I hate the most. Do not do that. So we know God never intended for Isaac to get sacrificed. But Abraham passed the biggest test of his life. That his heart was after the one who gave the promise, not the promise itself. So what's the takeaway here? I want you to open up your phone. And that thing you wrote down as your test. And I want you to write down this question. Am I going to love God, or am I going to love what God has to give me? Can I give you a clue? If you pick God, you also get the good stuff too. Okay? So you might as well pick the one where you get both. Does that make sense? Am I going to pick God, or am I going to pick the good that God has to give me. Because he is good. He will give you the good. But at what expense? Testing shows what you are really made of. And so this test that you're going through right now, one day you'll look back and you'll realize, wow, God really used that test to grow my faith. Literally, I looked back 3.5 years ago and I was like, wait a second, I already did this message. And I realized, wow, in those 3.5 years, I did not know it then because it felt like I was in the valley then. But God really used that to grow my faith. Can I have the praise team up? The answer to your test is to trust the one who keeps the promise. Can we all stand in the room? I don't know what your test is. Some of you guys, I can guess a couple of things that are going on in your life. Others of you, maybe there's a lot more that I don't know. But the point is, in the testing, in the difficulty, what will you do? We're going to sing this song together, Oceans. And it's a perfect song because who wants to just walk into the ocean? I mean, like a little bit, right? But you know how ocean shelves work? Like the ocean, okay? Not all y'all are mountain locked, so like landlocked here. 7 years in California. You know, there's a point where you can feel the sand underneath you, and then there's a point somewhere along the way where you can't feel anything. It goes like this. It goes, and it's like gone. And I swear your mind thinks there's a shark underneath you, okay? Like, who wants to go in that part of the ocean just for fun, you know? But that is often what God is inviting us to. He's saying, knowing me, loving me, following me, it will be the greatest adventure of your life. And it will cause you to freak out the most in your life, and it will require the greatest amount of faith. But he asks us slowly, little by little, to step out in faith with him. And so consider today your invitation to that faith, to that journey of knowing him. Let's sing together.